The summer break is over, the cars are back on track, and Formula One has barely given anyone time to breathe before throwing us straight into a sprint weekend at Zandvoort. And this time, there's a very interesting question hanging over the Dutch Grand Prix. What if Mercedes has been quietly saving a massive amount of performance for the second half of the season? Because on the surface, the headlines make it sound pretty ordinary. Mercedes is bringing what it describes as relatively minor changes. Ferrari is expected to have a new floor. McLaren has another upgrade. Red Bull doesn't appear to be bringing anything particularly dramatic. Nothing there screams game changer. But then James Allison started talking. And when Mercedes' technical boss starts explaining that the team is finding aerodynamic performance at a development rate several times higher than it was last year, you probably want to pay attention. Because suddenly, that word minor starts looking a whole lot more interesting. The Dutch Grand Prix is already a difficult weekend for introducing upgrades because this is a sprint event. Normally, a team can arrive at a Grand Prix, run 3 practice sessions, compare different setups, test new components, analyze the data overnight, and gradually figure out what the car wants. This weekend, that luxury is gone. You get 1 practice session, then it gets serious. So if Mercedes really has unlocked a significant amount of performance in the wind tunnel, Zandvoort is a fascinating place to find out whether that performance exists on the actual circuit. And there's another reason this matters. Mercedes isn't just fighting for race wins anymore. It's fighting to control the championship situation inside its own garage. Kimi Antonelli comes into the second half of the season ahead of George Russell, and on paper, that gap looks pretty substantial. But the story underneath those numbers is much more complicated. George has had an absolutely brutal run of bad luck. Engine problems, strategy issues, pit stop mistakes, and other team-related problems have repeatedly cost him opportunities. Antonelli has had his own difficult moments, of course, but Russell's side of the garage has arguably been hit harder. That means the championship standings don't necessarily tell the entire story of the Mercedes battle. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Formula One doesn't award points for what should have happened. It awards points for what actually happened, and right now Antonelli has the advantage. That creates another fascinating question. Should Mercedes start prioritizing him? The team says no. At least, not in the traditional sense. Mercedes has made it clear that it doesn't intend to pick one driver simply because that driver is ahead in the championship. If Antonelli is leading Russell, that doesn't automatically mean Russell becomes a support act. The philosophy is essentially simple. If one Mercedes can win, the team will do whatever is necessary to maximize the team's result. But that's very different from saying, this is our championship leader, so everybody else works for him. And that distinction could become incredibly important later in the year. Because if Mercedes suddenly finds half a second of performance that its rivals weren't expecting, the team could find itself in a position where it has a genuine championship contender on its hands. And that brings us to the most intriguing part of Allison's comments. Mercedes says its aerodynamic development rate is currently far steeper than it was last year. According to Allison, the team is finding roughly half a second of lap time over a period of about 2 months, with the rate of improvement dramatically higher than it was during the previous season. Now, obviously, you shouldn't hear that number and immediately assume Mercedes is about to show up at Zandvoort and destroy everybody. That's not how Formula One works. Wind tunnel performance doesn't automatically translate into half a second on the stopwatch. Correlation matters. Tire behavior matters. Track characteristics matter. Ride height matters. Mechanical setup matters. And, especially in a sprint weekend, the team has very little time to figure all of that out. But the bigger point is that Mercedes appears to believe there is still substantial performance available from this car. And that changes the entire second half of the season. Think about it this way. Ferrari might have 1 upgrade arriving at Zandvoort, another engine development expected later, and additional aerodynamic changes further down the road. McLaren continues to evolve its car. Red Bull is trying to extract everything it can from its package. But if Mercedes has found a much larger step than expected, counting upgrades isn't enough. 1 giant step can beat 3 smaller ones. That's the part fans sometimes miss when looking at development schedules. It isn't about who has the longest list of new parts. It's about who gets the most lap time from those parts. And Mercedes is now suggesting it may have been operating on a slightly different development cycle from its rivals. The team deliberately left some aerodynamic and bodywork development later than usual. The idea was essentially to launch the season with a strong enough package while keeping a much steeper development curve available for later. That's a risky strategy. If it works, you can explode into the second half of the season while your rivals are already fighting with diminishing returns. If it doesn't work, you've simply spent half a season waiting for performance that never arrives. So now we're about to find out which one this is. And I want to know what you think. Do you believe Mercedes has genuinely been holding a significant amount of performance in reserve? Or do you think this is simply the kind of confident messaging teams use before bringing a smaller upgrade package? Because if Mercedes has actually cracked the development problem, the championship could look very different by the time we reach the final stretch. And that's why this supposedly minor Dutch GP upgrade might be one of the most important stories of the entire weekend. And while Mercedes may be the team creating the biggest mystery heading into Zandvoort, it would be a mistake to assume the Dutch Grand Prix is already theirs to lose. McLaren still has one of the strongest packages in Formula One. Ferrari is bringing more development. And then there's the small matter of Max Verstappen racing at a circuit where he's historically been almost impossible to beat. That's what makes this weekend so fascinating. Zandvoort doesn't give teams much room to hide. The track is narrow, technical, and extremely demanding on aerodynamic efficiency. The banking creates its own challenges, and with the sprint format, teams have almost no time to understand whether a new package is genuinely better or simply behaving differently. That's a huge distinction. A new floor might look fantastic in the wind tunnel. A new bodywork package might produce impressive numbers on paper. But if the car becomes more difficult to set up, overheats its tires, or becomes unpredictable over a long run, that shiny upgrade can quickly turn into an expensive headache. And that's where McLaren comes into the picture. The team has another upgrade this weekend, and you simply can't overlook it. Lando Norris has historically been extremely strong around Zandvoort, while Oscar Piastri has also shown that he can extract serious performance from the McLaren when the conditions line up. Remember, this is the same team that won the most recent race before the summer break. So even if Mercedes suddenly takes a big step forward, McLaren isn't going to politely move out of the way. And there's another interesting layer here. Last season, McLaren's development appeared to benefit Norris more than Piastri. Certain changes to the car helped Norris feel more comfortable. And once that happened, his confidence and performance really took off during the second half of the campaign. So now you've got to wonder whether another upgrade could create a similar situation. Will McLaren's new package strengthen both drivers equally? Could it favor one side of the garage? Or will it simply give the team another weapon against Mercedes and Ferrari? That's something worth watching very closely once the cars hit the track. Then there's Ferrari. And this is where things get complicated. Ferrari is expected to bring a new floor to Zandvoort, while additional developments are already being discussed for later races. The team isn't giving up on this championship fight, and it shouldn't. Lewis Hamilton currently has the stronger position inside Ferrari compared with Charles Leclerc. Hamilton has been ahead of his teammate in the championship, and that naturally makes him the more realistic Ferrari candidate if the team is thinking purely about the Drivers' Championship. But Leclerc isn't out of the picture, not even close. And that's exactly why Ferrari's situation is becoming increasingly uncomfortable. At some point, if one driver is clearly in a stronger championship position, the team has to decide whether it wants to maximize the individual title opportunity or continue treating both drivers exactly the same. That's not an easy decision. Drivers don't want to be told that they're number two. Teams don't want to create tension inside the garage. And fans certainly love arguing about it. But Formula One history is full of examples where a team waited too long to make a difficult call. Ferrari may eventually have to answer the same question. If Hamilton is still ahead several races from now, and Leclerc is no longer realistically positioned to challenge for the title, does Ferrari start giving Hamilton more strategic priority? Or does it continue allowing both drivers to race freely? And here's the interesting part. We've already seen a situation where Ferrari could have chosen to help Hamilton without actually costing the team anything. At the Hungarian Grand Prix, Hamilton had a 5-second penalty. Leclerc finished ahead of him, but there was a possibility of managing the gap so that Hamilton would still finish in the stronger position. Ferrari didn't do it. Leclerc kept pushing. Hamilton lost those additional points. From a pure team perspective, you can understand both sides. Leclerc had earned his position on track. Why should he voluntarily give it away? But championship campaigns aren't always about what feels fair in the moment. They're about maximizing the final result. And if Ferrari genuinely believes Hamilton is its best shot at the Drivers' Championship, that philosophy may eventually have to change. Mercedes faces a similar question, but there's an important difference. Mercedes currently has Antonelli ahead of Russell, yet the team insists it isn't going to formally favor one driver. Instead, Mercedes' message is that the team comes first. If one Mercedes is fighting for a race win and another Mercedes is holding up that opportunity, then the team can intervene. That's not necessarily driver favoritism, that's just Formula One. And we've already seen Mercedes acknowledge that if switching positions between its drivers is necessary to secure a victory, it can do that. The difference is subtle but important. Mercedes isn't saying Antonelli must finish ahead of Russell. It's saying if a Mercedes can win this race, we're going to make sure the team gets the best possible result. That leaves both drivers with a clear incentive. Go faster. Because if you're the driver with the pace, you've got the strongest argument, and that's exactly how it should be. There's no hiding behind championship politics when the stopwatch is sitting there staring you in the face. Now, let's bring Max Verstappen into this, because no discussion about the Dutch Grand Prix is complete without talking about the home hero. Verstappen has been extraordinary at Zandvoort. His record here has made the Dutch Grand Prix feel almost like a personal event. And whenever Formula One returns to this circuit, there's always an expectation that Max will somehow find a way to be competitive. The problem this time is that Red Bull doesn't appear to be bringing a major upgrade package. And that matters, because Verstappen can extract ridiculous amounts from a Formula One car, but even he has limits. You can't consistently overcome a fundamental performance deficit with driving alone. Still, counting Verstappen out would be one of the easiest mistakes you could make. We've seen it before. A circuit suits the car, the conditions change, tire behavior falls into place, the setup suddenly clicks, and a driver who looked like an outsider on Friday becomes a championship threat on Sunday. That's especially possible at Zandvoort, and the sprint format only increases the uncertainty. One wrong setup decision can ruin an entire weekend. One brilliant setup decision can transform it. That's why I wouldn't be surprised if we see the competitive order change multiple times from Friday through Sunday. And there's one more driver worth watching closely, Isaac Hadjar. Last year at Zandvoort, Hadjar scored what was then his first Formula One podium, and the memory of that weekend is still attached to him in a very unusual way. He famously ended up breaking the Dutch Grand Prix trophy during the celebrations. This year, he's bringing a special helmet that references that moment, including the trophy. It's a great bit of personality from a driver who is still building his identity in Formula One. And honestly, those are the little stories that make a race weekend feel alive. Because while the championship battle gets most of the attention, Formula One is also about those unexpected moments. The driver who suddenly finds confidence. The midfield team that gets the setup exactly right. The rookie who produces a result nobody saw coming. And with a sprint weekend, there's even less room for predictability. So when the lights go out, don't just watch the front row. Watch how the new parts behave. Watch who can get the tires into the window. Watch whether Mercedes immediately looks stronger. Watch whether McLaren's upgrade gives Norris and Piastri another step. Watch whether Ferrari's floor actually delivers the performance the team expects. And, above all, watch Verstappen. Because Zandvoort has a habit of making people underestimate just how much difference a driver can make when the circuit suits him. But while all of these teams are preparing for the Dutch Grand Prix, there are two other stories quietly developing in the background that could have much bigger consequences for Formula One than one weekend's result. One involves Aston Martin and a new engine. The other involves Cadillac making a major shift in where it wants its Formula One operation to live. And both stories tell us something important about where this sport is heading next. And that brings us to the part of this story that could easily get overlooked while everyone is focused on Mercedes, Ferrari, McLaren, and Verstappen. Aston Martin is arriving at Zandvoort with a new power unit specification, and on paper, this could be one of the most significant engine upgrades we've seen from the team this season. Now, let's be realistic. This isn't suddenly going to turn Aston Martin into a championship contender. The gap to the front is still too large for one engine update to magically solve everything. But if the new specification gives the team the horsepower it's expecting, it could finally help Aston Martin fight its way into the midfield battle more consistently. And right now, that's what the team desperately needs. The funny part is that the biggest challenge may not even be performance. It could be penalties. Aston Martin has already had enough power unit and battery related issues that the team is approaching or potentially exceeding its component allocation. And when that happens, there's a strange strategic opportunity. If you're already going to take a grid penalty, why not replace everything you possibly can? It sounds ridiculous, but in Formula One, sometimes the smartest move is to accept the pain all at once. Instead of taking one penalty now, another later, and then potentially another one when you're fighting for important points, Aston Martin could effectively reset the car's power unit components and take the hit at a circuit where the damage can be managed. Starting at the back sounds terrible, but if you're already struggling at the back, it doesn't necessarily change your situation as much as you'd think. The real objective is to make sure that once the penalties are gone, the team has fresh components and more performance available for the races that matter. That's the kind of calculated gamble that can make sense for a team trying to close a massive development gap. And Aston Martin needs exactly that kind of aggressive thinking. Because while Mercedes, Ferrari, and McLaren are fighting over the sharp end of the grid, Aston Martin is trying to escape a completely different problem, becoming irrelevant. That's why this engine matters. Even if the performance gain isn't spectacular, every bit of horsepower helps. Every improvement in efficiency helps. Every step toward closing the gap gives the engineers more to work with. And then there's Cadillac. This is where the Formula One story gets even more interesting. Cadillac has now brought Martin Budkowski into the team principal role, replacing Graham Loudon, and the bigger picture is becoming increasingly clear. Cadillac wants to build a much more American-centered Formula One operation. The team has never hidden that ambition. The original idea was always to establish a major presence in the United States, particularly around Indianapolis, while still taking advantage of the enormous Formula One talent base in Britain. And that creates a fascinating problem. Formula One may be global, but a huge amount of its technical expertise is concentrated around the UK's motorsport valley. That's where generations of aerodynamicists, engineers, mechanics, designers, strategists, and technical specialists have built their careers. So if Cadillac says, "We're going to move more of the operation to America," the obvious question is, can it do that without sacrificing access to that talent? That's not an easy question to answer. America has enormous engineering talent. It has incredible technology companies. It has world-class automotive expertise. It has an enormous motorsport culture. But Formula One is a very specific ecosystem. You don't simply hire a brilliant engineer from another industry and expect them to immediately understand everything about F1 aerodynamics, tire behavior, cost cap restrictions, regulations, race operations, and the bizarre little details that can make or break a Grand Prix weekend. Formula One experience matters. And that's why Cadillac's approach is so interesting. The team isn't necessarily saying it's abandoning Silverstone. Instead, the message is that the center of gravity will gradually move toward the United States while recruitment continues in America. In other words, don't think of it as switching off the UK operation overnight. Think of it as building a second major center. That could actually be a very smart long-term strategy. If Cadillac can combine American resources with British Formula One expertise, it could create something genuinely different from the traditional European-based teams. But if the transition becomes too aggressive, there could be a cost. Imagine you're an engineer working in Britain. Your job suddenly requires you to move across the Atlantic. That's not just a career decision. It's your house, your family, your children's schools, your partner's career, your entire life. So even if Cadillac offers to make the move financially attractive, not everyone is going to say yes. And if enough experienced people decide they'd rather stay in Britain, Cadillac could lose valuable knowledge just when it's trying to establish itself. That's why this is a story worth watching over the next couple of years. Not because Cadillac is suddenly in trouble, it isn't, but because building an F1 team from scratch is incredibly difficult and every structural decision matters. And while Cadillac is thinking about where its people should work, the established teams are thinking about something much more immediate: how to win the 2026 championship. That's where the Dutch Grand Prix becomes so important. This isn't just another race, it's the first real test of who actually used the summer break intelligently. Did Mercedes find the performance it claims to have found? Did Ferrari's development program finally start producing the kind of gains the team needs? Can McLaren continue its momentum? And can Verstappen once again turn Zandvoort into his personal playground? Those are the questions we're about to get answers to. But there's something even bigger underneath all of this. The second half of this Formula One season could become a development war. Teams aren't simply racing each other on Sunday anymore. They're racing each other's engineers from Monday through Friday. Every week, somebody is trying to find a 10th. Then another 10th, then another. And sometimes one team finds something that changes the entire competitive order. That's exactly why Mercedes' comments are so important. If the team really has been operating slightly out of phase with its rivals and deliberately holding back aerodynamic development until later in the year, then we could be about to see Mercedes unleash the performance it has been building toward. And if that happens, Ferrari may suddenly have a serious problem, because Ferrari has its own development plan. It has its floor upgrade, it has future engine developments, it has more aerodynamic changes coming. But development plans only matter if the lap time arrives. Mercedes doesn't need more upgrades than Ferrari. It needs better upgrades. That's the entire game. And the same thing applies to McLaren. The team can continue bringing parts, but if Mercedes suddenly finds a huge step, McLaren's advantage could disappear surprisingly quickly. Then there's Verstappen. He doesn't need to have the fastest car on paper to become a factor. If Red Bull gets the setup right, if the tires behave, and if the track conditions suit the car, Max can turn a seemingly ordinary weekend into something much more dangerous. That's why I'm not ready to write anyone off before the first serious running at Zandvoort. And honestly, that's what makes this stage of the season so exciting. We've reached the point where every upgrade matters. Every setup decision matters. Every pit stop matters. Every strategy call matters. And now, with the sprint format reducing the amount of practice available, one mistake can snowball into an entire weekend of damage. So, here's the big question I want you to answer. If Mercedes really has the performance James Allison is talking about, does that make Kimi Antonelli the favorite to control the championship from here? Or can Ferrari, McLaren, and Verstappen respond before Mercedes gets too far ahead? And there's another question I'd love to hear your opinion on. If Hamilton remains Ferrari's strongest championship hope, should the team eventually prioritize him over Leclerc? There isn't an easy answer. And that's exactly why it's worth debating. Because Formula One isn't just about who has the fastest car today. It's about who makes the smartest decisions when the pressure gets higher. That's the lesson from all of these stories. Mercedes may have the biggest hidden performance reserve. Ferrari may have the next opportunity to close the gap. McLaren may still have the most complete package. Verstappen may have the circuit advantage. Aston Martin is gambling on power, and Cadillac is building for the future. But only one team will look back at the end of the season and say they got the second half right. So now it's your turn. Do you think Mercedes is about to surprise everyone at Zandvoort? Or are we giving too much credit to the team's development claims? And if Ferrari has to choose one driver later in the season, should that driver be Hamilton, or should Leclerc still get the same opportunity? Drop your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to see where you stand. And if you've been following this Formula One news channel and enjoying the coverage, now is the perfect time to support us. Hit the like button, share this video with another F1 fan, and subscribe to Fast News F1 with notifications turned on. We're pushing toward 4,000 subscribers, and every single subscription helps the channel keep growing and bringing you more fast, sharp, no-nonsense Formula One coverage. Because the Dutch Grand Prix is only the beginning. The second half of this season could get absolutely wild, and you don't want to miss what comes next. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and I'll see you in the next Fast News F1 update.